This is Active Recall, another 9 connections exercise where I share what I'm learning. The 3 sources are The Power of Moments, Creative Confidence, and the Story Grid podcast. And the ideas that these connect to are The Power of Moments, Peak Moments, and the End, from Creative Confidence, Constraints for Creativity, and then from the Story Grid podcast, just the spectrum of the war of art to outliers. So this first connection, from The Power of Moments, there's this peak moments and the end, and it just talks about how a lot of times we remember just the peak moments and the end of something. So the example in the book, well, I've only read the first chapter because only the first chapter is released. It was like a preview. They talk about going on vacation to Disneyland, like a family trip to Disneyland, and what you remember from that day at Disneyland will be the peak moments and how it ended. So the peak moments would be like your favorite ride and then just how it ended. You don't really remember the average of all the moments put together. It's just the peaks and the end. So this reminds me of a video I watched recently, Nerd Writer. He talks about moments versus scenes and talks about why Zack Snyder focuses a little too much on moments instead of scenes, and he takes a lot of examples from Superman versus Batman, or Batman versus Superman. And that got me thinking about the eclipse, which happened earlier this week, where everyone is focused on... I actually learned a lot about eclipses and things like that in the past week, so I thought it was just a moment or even a couple minutes, but then I learned, it's a couple hours where the moon is passing over the sun, and there wasn't just like this single moment, and a lot of the anticipation was what was fun about it, just like the days leading up to it and then the hours leading up to it, everyone heading out and things like that. And then it also reminds me of Essentialism by Greg McKeown. That book is about... Well, a story in that book is that he really wanted to get into Stanford, and he only applied to Stanford. So... And he talks about that. Like, there's a case where, since he was only trying to apply to Stanford, he could have had just like that single moment, but he wasn't focused on that moment. A lot of times we achieve things and then you are disappointed, or not disappointed, but like that moment feels good and then it fades away. So he talks about the importance of looking forward to a new journey instead of just a moment. So that moment paid off, or getting into Stanford paid off, because it was a completely new journey, and that's what he was looking forward to, and it kept getting back. So the second source and connection, Creative Confidence, and from that book, there's this idea of just constraints for creativity. An exercise in that is you draw, I think you have like a printout of 30 circles, and then you try to draw 30 different objects within those circles. I've seen this exercise of where you just draw 30 faces, or you could just do anything, but you start with that circular shape, or that circular shape. You start with literally a circle. This reminds me of Understanding Comics, which I'm reading right now, where it talks about just the constraints that you have in comics, where you have the different boxes on the page. Also, it talks about the only actual sense you're using when you're reading comics is visual, but in comics, they're able to portray sound within those constraints. Then the constraint of time reminds me of design sprints, different exercises, different design exercises. If you have 2 hours to make something versus 10 minutes, then it's going to be different. Also just reminds me of that idea, I think I read it in Tools of Titans, and it's just one of the questions that Tim Ferriss asks often. I think he got it from Peter Thiel, but it's just, instead of looking at like long term, you break down your goal into, you just ask yourself, like, what if you had to do it in the next 6 months? And it starts to get your brain thinking about what the most important parts of that are, and then you start getting like creative about how you would achieve that. Then third is the Story Grid podcast, and the connection, or the story there is they talk about War of Art and Outliers and the difference between how Stephen Pressfield does nonfiction and how Malcolm Gladwell does nonfiction. So War of Art is mostly story-based and based on Stephen Pressfield's experiences, and then Outliers, Malcolm Gladwell, he takes that journalistic approach and interviews a lot of people, lots of interviews, lots of just like he used to be a journalist, so taking that approach, and both are effective. This reminds me of right now I'm reading Made to Stick, and it talks about what makes ideas stay in people's minds. A lot of it has to do with storytelling. So in both cases, War of Art, it's stories about his experiences, Stephen Pressfield's experiences. Outliers, it is Malcolm Gladwell creates a story based on an idea, and he talks about how that idea came to be, and then where that idea will go and what things apply to that idea. So there's just a bigger overall story from the idea, and then the smaller stories that come with it, and it's clearly effective. Like his isn't the only book about it, but it is definitely, like, if you hear the 10,000 hour rule, people associate that with Outliers instead of the other books about it, and the other books about like talent and things like that. Then this also reminds me of his other book, The Tipping Point. So that just, again, so tying that to the Story Grid podcast, they often talk about the Tipping Point's introduction, and it's about like Hush Puppies and how those shoes got popular again, and how that idea spread. And then this just reminds me of, going back to Stephen Pressfield, the idea of the resistance. A lot of people, I've read a lot of these like unleash your creativity types of books, and people will write about different things, and some will even mention the resistance by name, or just call it the resistance, lowercase. But similar to like Malcolm Gladwell, Outliers, and being associated with deliberate practice and 10,000 hours instead of the actual researcher Anders Ericsson, Stephen Pressfield is the one associated with the resistance, and it's because it was this, he made a good story about it through his experience and named it, and it's something people can relate to, and it was an idea that was sticky. So that was the 9 connections for today. This is my learning vlog. If you want to check out more or other just like book notes, hit subscribe. Thanks a lot.